So, Aaron, I thought we'd maybe start chronologically and we'd start with your journey and what led up to you transitioning. Was it 15 years ago now?
I think it was 15 years. I feel like I've been saying 15 years for the last 3 years. So, but
Well, the years
yeah,
kind of
it's
merged together the last few months.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's been about 15 years. I mean, how I describe it now is probably quite different than how I would have described it, even 5 years ago, because I've learned a lot about what gender dysphoria is over the last couple of years. So I'll describe it using some of the terminology as I understand it today. So I had what I would call sorry, I have what I would call early childhood onset gender dysphoria. From it started about age 3. So as soon as I was able to start categorizing males and females into separate categories, I started to experience it. Of course, I had no language to describe it. It was very confusing. But whenever I was confronted with a situation in which I had to figure out which category I belong in, so anything from going to a toy store where toys are categorized male or female, or choosing clothing where there's a boys section and there's a girls section, or at school when you tell all the boys line up on one side of the gym and all the girls on the other. So all of those kinds of situations where I had to make a cognitive decision to categorize myself. That's when it would come up and cause me confusion and distress. Because I just had this sense that I couldn't explain that I belonged in the male category for some reason, even though I knew
Mm.
that technically wasn't true. I still had this just persistent, relenting drive or feeling that was the case, and that some kind of mistake had been made. So that's I think a fairly, when we think of a trans person or a kid, that's often the narrative that we think of, is just these kids that from a very early age demonstrate extreme gender nonconformity. And my parents would say the same thing. It wasn't, I mean, I didn't discuss it with them. They didn't know my internal struggle, but they certainly knew that I just had this persistence to always appear like a boy, to the extent that in elementary school I was registered on a boys baseball team for a season, because people that didn't know me personally and didn't know my family thought that I was a boy. And that continued throughout my childhood. There were definitely periods where I tried to just kind of cooperate with societal norms and appear more feminine. I tried to do that to fit in, but it felt very inauthentic to me. My high school grad, I wore a dress just because I wanted my parents to be able to have their photographs and appreciate that moment. And but I felt like a drag queen doing that. So that was sort of, in short, my childhood experience. I mean, things like if I went swimming and I would just see all the other boys, they wore swim trunks, and that's what I wanted to do. There were times I went swimming with just a pair of shorts on and no shirt, as a child, before my body developed, of course. But it was when puberty and my body developed that things became extra distressing, because
Mm.
my mind had mapped my body according to how I saw myself. So my mind had people, a lot of trans men even talk about having experienced like a phantom penis as though it had been amputated. So our minds sometimes map, when you have this type of gender dysphoria, it maps your body according to your self perception. And so I experienced my own body as having a flat chest and stuff. And so when I started to develop breasts in adolescence, it felt like tumors attached to my body, because it didn't fit with how my mind had mapped my body. So sort of the reverse effect, I think, of like a phantom sensation if a body part had been amputated. When I was 19, I was having a lot of all through adolescence. I was having a lot of gynecological problems, and when I was 19, I eventually had a diagnosis. I had a very large internal cyst that was causing me problems, about the size of a grapefruit. And so I went and had surgery to get that removed. It was attached to what was believed to be an ovary at that time. And when it was removed, the surgeon said, the cyst had damaged my internal organs to the extent that they had to just remove some of the internal organs, because they couldn't differentiate between the cyst and the organs. And they did a biopsy on the ovary at that time, and it came back no cancer or anything, but it came back having been an ovotestes, which is like a it's like a hybrid ovary testicle. It contains tissue of both. The surgeon at that time just reassured me that it was gone. It is a cancer risk when you have one. So it is a very, very rare disorder of sex development, or what people might more commonly understand as an intersex condition. So I didn't know I had it up until that point. There had been no external signs that I had an intersex condition. My testosterone levels had always been high, but I didn't know that I had this DSD until I was 19. But he just sort of brushed it under the rug. He said it's gone, so it's not going to cause you any more problems, and so don't worry about it. And he didn't know that I experienced gender dysphoria. So when I learned that, in my mind, the gender dysphoria and that condition were somehow related. I am also same-sex attracted. I lived my early adult life in the lesbian community and met a lot of very masculine butch lesbians at that time, and started to make sense of it as this is something that some gay and lesbian people experience, that we are masculinized or feminized for some reason, both in our mind and bodies. So I didn't give it much more thought than that. I mean, it was still something I struggled with that never went away, but that's how I understood it for many years. Until I saw a documentary on TV. So I would have been about 33 at that time. I think it was 2005 or 2006. I saw this documentary on mainstream television about trans kids. And they were just, the kids were telling their stories, and their stories sounded identical to mine. This early childhood onset, persistent experience of cross-sex identification. And they said that the way that the documentary was framing that was, if you have these experiences, it means you are a trans person. So I don't think they talked about, back then it was gender identity disorder, not gender dysphoria. So back then they didn't talk about that disorder. They just said, if you experience this, you're a trans kid, and these kids were all transitioning. So I thought, okay, well then that explains my experience then, because that is absolutely, they described my experience to a T. And so it was very easy to convince me then that because I had these experiences, that it meant I was a trans person, as like this separate category of personhood. And so I bought that, and very quickly, went to a gender clinic and said, look, I have these experiences and I saw this documentary, so I must be a trans person. And they heard my experiences and said, yeah, I mean, you must be a trans person. And I didn't understand what gender dysphoria really was at that time. I didn't know any of the medical literature. And I was started on hormones, and I did go through an assessment process over several months. So back then there was an assessment process before hormones, and then again before any surgery. So I was evaluated by a psychologist again before I had any surgeries done. So that's it in a nutshell, in terms of how I just sort of arrived at the medical transition.
And so before the surgery, during that sort of assessment process, was there any doubt on your part, or were you like very certain before getting the surgeries? Or was there any sort of obviously there was contemplation, but was there any thoughts that maybe this wasn't the right thing to do?
My reservations were, there was no doubt in my mind that I was a trans person according to that definition, because, it was very clear that I had that experience from a very early age that never went away. So I was never unclear about that. When I did receive the diagnosis of gender identity disorder, I believe that diagnosis was correct. I had reservations about the medical aspects of it, just because of any, the potential risks. It seemed very far-fetched. It seemed like a Pinocchio story, that it seemed really far-fetched to think, well, I'm never really going to be a boy, and worries that these medical interventions would, cause cancer or something. So I definitely had reservations about the long-term health benefits, but I didn't have any doubts. Like some people, they talk about, am I trans enough, or am I actually trans? I never had any doubt that I had gender identity disorder, because that was very clear to everyone around me when I was a child.
And so those words, gender identity disorder and gender dysphoria, Maybe we should start with defining what are they? What does that mean?
So, according to the DSM-5, so our current diagnostic manual,
Mhm.
describes three separate pathways to gender dysphoria. So one being the childhood onset type that I experienced, which is highly correlated with homosexuality. There are sorry, I'll get to the second one in a minute.
Sure.
So that type. So there's one pathway of that early childhood onset, especially in the boys. It's very almost guaranteed that those boys will end up being same sex attracted. The girls, there's still a strong correlation with homosexuality with girls, but it's not as strong as with the boys. There are
Okay.
some heterosexual women that experience childhood gender dysphoria who do outgrow it, but most kids, male or female, with childhood onset gender dysphoria are going to be same sex attracted as adults. So that's one type. The second type is associated with transvestic disorder. People that have sexual arousal to cross dressing, some of those people experienced something called autogynephilia. So beyond just feeling arousal to wearing women's clothing, they also experience arousal to the idea of having a female body.
Mhm.
And that can progress into gender dysphoria, especially later in life. So those boys aren't typically gender nonconforming as children. They're usually very typical heterosexual boys. Often keep that the sexual arousal part a secret. You know, they might try on their mother's clothing in secret when no one's at home, for example. So parents aren't often aware that that's happening, and it tends to, you know, because children aren't overtly sexual, but it tends to intensify in adolescence for those boys. So they might be very typical boys up until adolescence, but when their sexuality kicks in,
Mhm.
those feelings might intensify, and that might at some point later in life progress into gender dysphoria, meaning the strong desire to actually become women.
Mhm.
And then the third type, which is very rare, is related to intersex conditions. There are a handful of, because there's many different kinds of intersex conditions, and not all intersex people experience this, but there are some intersex conditions where gender dysphoria tends to be more common. It's mostly the natal females that were exposed to too much testosterone during fetal development may kind of have this strong sense of I was assigned wrong
Mhm.
at birth. So that's my understanding of gender dysphoria, those three separate pathways.
So, using the words gender dysphoria, it well, to me, it has medical implications, or it implies it has medical connotations. That's what I'm looking for. And so, I suppose some people would maybe say that that's wrong to say that it's a medical condition or it's anything. It's a psychological condition. Some people would say no, it's just that they were born in the wrong body and that they are a woman or they are a man. So I suppose what would you say to that argument?
Well, I do think it's a condition of some kind. I think there's
Mm-hmm.
still a lot not understood about it. You know, whether
Mm-hmm.
there is something neurologically different about us, whether it is like a mental health condition, I don't. I think there's still a lot of question marks about what causes it and what is it. I'm leaning towards the developmental model of it. I think it's a part of the psychological development of gay and lesbian people in terms of the childhood aspect of it. Because most people with childhood gender dysphoria do outgrow it. So if it was like a wired in mechanism, I wouldn't think that it would be possible for someone to outgrow it. But what psychologists developmental psychologists like Dr. Zucker, for example, who used to run a clinic back in the 70s and 80s and 90s into the early 2000s, he felt that if you catch it early enough in childhood, you can kind of help it to desist before it really solidifies into a stable, concrete identity. But he feels, and as many psychologists do, that if it persists into adolescence and early adulthood, the chances of it desisting at that point is unlikely because it's a solidified sense of self. And undoing that at that point could potentially do psychological harm.
So before you transitioned, you said that you had a period of time where there was assessments, psychological assessments, and stuff like that. So that wouldn't be described as gender affirming? Like the psychological test, was that affirmation, or was that purely just listening and trying to gauge the situation?
When I was assessed, so it was the very beginnings of what we call the affirmation model. So there still was an assessment process, but it wasn't so much for the purpose of trying to help you not be that thing. It was very much for the purpose: are you psychologically of sound enough mind to make these
Right.
choices for yourself? And so it's gone a lot more in that direction over the years, where assessment is slowly being whittled down more and more and more,
Mm-hmm.
seeing it as more of a human rights issue that people have a right to do with their bodies what they want, as opposed to any kind of diagnosis or um, you know, there's less and less of a role of a clinician in the process to be a decision maker in that process. But back to your question, just before we get too far from the question of
Sure.
gender affirming or affirming that you are the sex that you think you are. My understanding of it is it's a condition of some kind, that if it persists into adulthood, it may not ever be resolvable. But I think we have choice. I think we have choices about what to do about that. I mean, I think if you think of it as this is a condition, we can choose to medicalize or not medicalize. I mean, a lot of butch lesbians that I knew over the years had gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder, and had, it's not that it ever went away, but they had a strong identity as a butch lesbian, and for them that was enough, and they didn't want to medicalize. And so it's not like all of those women are trans, and I wouldn't want to impose that label onto them. I think when we have this experience, and I think there's probably different degrees of severity of it, I think there's a lot of factors why some people can cope with it better than others. um, and I do reserve an adult's life to make that choice if they're suffering. But I see transition as a kind of legal fiction. I don't feel like, I'm not deluded. I don't think that I am a biological male in every way, just as if I had been born male. I think I have a legitimate medical reason for having the condition, but I still understand that the condition is in my head, whether it's neurological or psychological. It's a condition of my own perception of myself, and having medicalized and granted the opportunity to do this, I see that as a legal fiction, as an accommodation for a condition. I don't take it literally,
Mm.
and I think that matters in some situations and not others. I mean, when I go out and buy a loaf of bread, I don't think it matters. I don't think everyone in the grocery store needs to know my entire history and needs all the details. I don't think they'd care, and I don't think that would be appropriate. Um, but it matters in certain ways. It matters in terms of my most intimate relationships. It matters in terms of my medical care. It matters in terms of certain policies and laws, and I think that's becoming obscured by the
Mm.
politics that wants to see us as just men because we think we are, just women because we think we are. But I think it's more appropriate to think of it as it's a legal contract that we have with society, where we're granted the opportunity to do this if it provides us some relief from a condition. But I think we need clarity on what that legal fiction is. That we're
Mm.
granted this opportunity, but what are our responsibilities and what are the limits of that legal fiction? I don't think we've ever really clarified that, and I know that there are activists who want to take the extreme position on that and say, well, in terms of law, I just want to be considered as a trans woman, I just want to be considered legally female, or as a trans man, I just want to be considered legally male. But I think we need a more nuanced definition of these things that still allows me and people like me this opportunity as a treatment. But I think it's nonsensical, and I think we're already seeing very clear problems with completely denying biological reality.
And so that assessment process, has that, you were saying that that's changed since you transitioned. How has it changed? Is it, from what I'm gathering, it seems to have shortened drastically to the point where someone might go to a doctor and then say that they think they're trans, and then the doctor just says, yeah, okay, that's fine, and then they move forward with the surgeries. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I can't paint the entire system with one broad brush, because I think there's a lot of differences from clinic to clinic or office to office how people are practicing. I think some people are still doing careful assessment and are fighting really hard to defend that practice. And I think there are still those that are doing very ethical exploratory therapy and are trying really hard to defend that practice against accusations of conversion therapy. Excuse me. So I think there are still people doing good work, but I think there are now, well, I know for certain that there are now clinics that are really trying to eliminate all of that, and are assessing in a single visit, not doing any kind of comprehensive psychosocial assessment, but are just assessing, do you seem stable enough to make this decision? If yes, you get the green lights. So really eliminating any meaningful assessment. Like for example, a differential diagnosis. Like, what if somebody, and I know people like this, what if somebody has autism and they mistake their social difficulties, and they mistake some of their symptoms of autism for gender dysphoria? Now, I have a close friend who's in that boat. I also know a detransitioner in that boat where they had autism. They mistook autism for gender dysphoria, believed that transitioning would help with that, and it didn't, and then got the autism diagnosis after transitioning, and then once they had that diagnosis, realized, well, actually, now that I'm learning about autism, that maps onto my experiences better than a gender dysphoria diagnosis. So I think misdiagnosis can happen, and when we don't think of gender dysphoria as a condition anymore, because that's what the activists are pushing for, is this isn't a pathology at all. This isn't a diagnosis. I just am who I say I am. Well, if it's not a diagnosis of any kind, it makes it very difficult to do any kind of differential diagnosis for somebody. And when I was working with youth as a clinician, I had concerns about that, because some of these youth were coming in with very complex histories, psychiatric histories, trauma histories, very complex presentations. They're saying, I want to be trans, I want to change my body. And it's not like, I wasn't trying to say, no, you're not, and no, I'm not going to do this for you. But I really wanted to take my time to get to know these young people and help them understand these layers of things that they were experiencing, just to make sure that they were that they really, at the end of the day, felt like they were making the right choice for themselves. And my concern, and I was getting into trouble as a clinician for trying to take that time, because in my province, the push is towards that more informed consent model, where if they want it, they get it. And I think that's dangerous practice.
Well,
especially for minors.
Well, that's a nice segue into the next kind of body of questions I have, is when I speak about this issue, because I'm very fascinated by this issue, just because I think that the implications, the consequences, whether they're positive or negative, they have the potential to be very vast. Like I was just writing today about this topic, actually, just saying that I'm going to be recording this podcast, and I think the words I used was, it has the potential to change the fabric of society and culture, and so we really better get it right. And my worry is that if we get it wrong, it's young people that pay the price. And it really worries me. I'm not sure how much this is happening, because it is kind of mainstream narratives that I'm getting, that some of this information I'm getting is coming from. But children perhaps not needing parental consent to have possibly irreversible surgeries, possibly giving puberty blockers when they're under 18, that worries me. And it also worries me what you were saying there about people who detransition or people who regret the decision. People don't like to talk about that. They don't like to admit that there might be people that regret it, because that just goes against their sort of narrative. But we don't have the long-term studies for this sort of thing. For people who do regret it, you're not going to see that for a long time, because I just feel like it's growing so exponentially right now, and we're kind of rushing into all of this, especially policy wise. And I fear that it's young people that are going to pay the possible negative price of that.
Yeah, and it's not just the exponential growth that concerns me. I mean, that it does concern me, but more so it's the presentation of those people that are showing up that has changed. I mean, there's a lot of question marks about the nature of those people, because there probably is some growth, some natural growth from destigmatizing it, and it's in the media and people are aware of it. So I mean, like me, for example, it was very clear to everyone around me that something was going on for me from a very early age, but I never was taken to a gender clinic as a kid. So there probably were a lot of kids like me that were experiencing it. Nobody knew what it was. Trans wasn't on our radar. I had never even heard of anyone I grew up in a little farming town. I never even heard of anyone transitioning. So there probably are more of kids like me being taken to clinics at an earlier age. So I buy that to a certain extent, but I don't buy that is the reason for that 4,000% increase. And what's different about this new cohort, two things. Well, actually three things. So one is the sex ratio is completely flipped. Now, if you go back to what I was saying about the 3 pathways to gender dysphoria that are currently in the DSM-5, of those 3 pathways, about 80% of those are going to be males, natal males, because autogynephilia pretty much only happens to males. The homosexual subtype, there are far more gay men than there are gay women. And then among gay women, there are far fewer butch lesbians. And historically, it was only butch lesbians that were transitioning. So you've got, and they say that autogynephilia, that subtype, is the vast majority of trans women that were transitioning. So before we understood trans, and this was all a popular media darling, people who worked at gender clinics, they saw two types of people coming to the clinics. They saw mostly middle-aged men who had lived heterosexual lives. They were often married, had kids, often in the military. So that's mostly who was coming to clinics. And then when pediatric clinics opened up, they were seeing some kids, but most of those kids grew up to be gay or lesbians. So it was mostly heterosexual men transitioning. That was about 80%. The second largest group would have been the very highly effeminate gay men who had gender dysphoria. So they would have been like this very effeminate boys, and this insistence that they were girls, and so they were transitioning. And then a few butch lesbians, and then a handful of people with disorders of sex development. So if you think of about 80% of people who experience gender dysphoria are males, it doesn't make sense. Like having all these girls with no childhood history of extreme gender nonconforming behavior or expressing, I think a mistake is made. These girls in adolescence announcing that they're trans. We've never seen that before. And it doesn't map onto our understanding of what gender dysphoria is. Because those girls, if they were same-sex attracted, we would have seen some evidence of that in their childhood. So the type of gender dysphoria that emerges in adolescence or later in life was usually the autogynephilic type of males. So the sex ratio reversal doesn't make sense. And unless there's a type of gender dysphoria or a pathway to gender dysphoria that we just don't yet understand, but let's take our time to understand it. So I'm not saying that those girls maybe they do have a legitimate type of gender dysphoria, but we don't understand it yet. So that doesn't seem like the time to be opening up the doors wide open, saying, well, we're not going to assess you or understand you, because it's a completely new cohort of people that we're seeing at clinics.
Well, that was a point a previous guest had was about 2 years ago. Helen Pluckrose, she's a writer and editor of a magazine in London, and she made the point that the stats show, I think this is in the UK, that the number of teenage girls who identify as boys has shot up, whereas the amount of teenage girls who identify as lesbian is shot down. And so that shows that there's some form of a trend going on, that yes, the number will go up as it becomes destigmatized and it becomes more widely accepted, but probably not to that same extent. And she was saying that maybe being trans is the new kind of emo and goth, the kind of anti-culture identity. But the difference is that people aren't medically transitioning to emo or goth. People are now, like, children are now being, it's irreversible surgeries and stuff like that. So that's the main difference, and that's the worry I have, and that Helen had, and that you seem to have as well.
I do have that, and especially when, like me, if you get this message that these experiences that you have means you are a trans person, so not a gay person, not a butch lesbian, you are a trans person. That has been our narrative now for a good 15 years at least, and that's the message families and children are getting. So if kids like me have an experience of gender dysphoria, could be a very real diagnosable type of gender dysphoria, they're not being told, well, that's highly correlated with homosexuality. So it really limits their thinking about this. If someone had came to me and my family when I was 5, when it was obvious that I was struggling with something, and they said, hey, this is what it is. This is called gender identity disorder. It's something a lot of gay and lesbian people experience as children. Your child is probably going to grow up to be gay. That's what it means. And most of the time, people, once they become adults and sort out their sexuality, and support your child with their sexuality, embrace that, chances are this is going to resolve itself by the time they're an adult. That's the correct message according to the science. And that's not the message that families or children are receiving. So families and children are being told, you have these experiences, you're trans. So socially transition them. When they're older, let's medically transition them. That's the pathway. So they're not being given correct information, and they're not even being given an opportunity to resolve it and become a happy, healthy adult homosexual.
It seems that we seem to be forgetting that children and teenagers just go through phases. That's just the nature of being a child. I remember when I was like 3 or 4, I used to play for pram, and I used to play with dolls. And that was for a few months. My mum got me a pram, and I remember as soon as I got the pram, I didn't want it anymore. So, but the worrying thing there is that if that was in this time, and I had perhaps different parents, they might have thought you must be a girl then, if that's what you're doing. And so that's really worrying. And it's also just worrying that, like, teenagers go through multiple phases. That's the point of being a teenager, and your hormones are going crazy anyway. You've got massive mood swings, anxiety. And I think the problem is that now, in this age of social media and TikTok, that teenagers who feel disillusioned or are struggling with their identities, which is completely natural for a teenager, go onto TikTok, and there'll be an influencer there who says, I transitioned and that solved all of my problems. And then teenagers are so susceptible to that sort of thing. Well, some teenagers anyway. And if there's no barriers to transition, then that's worrying. It seems like we're just forgetting that teenagers have phases, and we should acknowledge that and just pump the brakes a bit.
Mm-hmm. I do absolutely believe that there is a youth subculture that's developed based on queer theory. It is a lot like goth or punk. They have a very specific sort of aesthetic that unfortunately also includes things like self-harm. So one of the really common aesthetics with a lot of the girls that are part of this youth subculture is, cutting on the upper arms, and a certain type of makeup and shaving eyebrows. And so and piercings. There's a very specific aesthetic with these young people. And I've known some of these kids personally. I have some in my life where I knew them growing up. They had some emotional dysregulation problems, but they're also very sensitive, smart They were very sensitive, smart girls, but weren't gender nonconforming, and are now as teenagers into this youth subculture, calling themselves different, neo pronouns, and the pronouns changing repeatedly, and the self harm scars that they don't hide. It's because it's part of the subculture, so they kind of want them to be visible, and I do think some of them take it too far and end up getting double mastectomies as part of. It's like a body modification cult.
Mm-hmm.
And
I've heard
it's alarming. Yeah.
I've heard anecdotally in some schools, this is in America that I was hearing this, that there's a hierarchy of identity of how cool or how popular you're going to be in school, and being trans is a very cool thing to be, and obviously right at the bottom would be like straight cisgendered man, and so that's where again, have you seen that sort of thing where it's that sort of, it's like intersectionality in schools. For anyone, the theory of intersectionality was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, and the theory to me is a useful theory for thinking about oppression, but the application of it is problematic. It basically says that oppression can't just be one road. It intersects between different forms of oppression. So a woman who's black will have two forms of oppression intersecting, from one being black and one from being women. And that seems to be what's happening in schools, where it's that sort of intersectionality and it's a hierarchy of intersectionality, and at the top would be trans, and at the bottom, like I said, cisgendered straight man.
Yeah, and it's I've always been left leaning, but in recent years that is one way in which I have walked away from the left. In term is that critical theory way of thinking about oppression. I mean, having lived part of my life as a butch lesbian, it's not that I don't believe that homophobia exists. It's not that I don't believe that racism exists. These are real experiences that should be addressed, absolutely. But I don't think I think critical theory really misses the mark in terms of a solution, and so I won't, and it's created separate problems. So I won't support it for that reason. But again, it's not because I don't want to do anything about discrimination. But it's right, like especially when you're a young person who, when you think of a teenager, their developmental task is to fit in somewhere. And if they are being taught the critical theory way of thinking through these problems, you're absolutely right that it creates a hierarchy in which the more oppressed you are, the more valid your voice is over anyone else's. It's like a social currency. And so if you're a straight white girl, and I say girl, it happens to boys too, but I say girl just because it's happening to them, I think, more so than the boys. But if you're straight and white, then you're boring, and you're an oppressor. And who wants to be an oppressor? But all you have to do is call yourself non-binary and do absolutely nothing. Maybe wear some funky clothing and some funky makeup, and suddenly you're not an oppressor anymore.
Yeah. How do you feel? How do you think schools should approach this issue of gender? At what age, or should it be introduced at all? Should it be part of any curriculum at schools? And I'm seeing that in the UK anyway. We're seeing that's being introduced in as early as primary school here.
Here as well. I'm in Canada, so yes, they're teaching like the gender spectrum and the gender unicorn and stuff in schools. And where's the evidence for that? Like, I don't even most people don't even know where that came from. Like, do you know where this idea of a gender spectrum came from? Like, no, we're all being taught it, but nobody knows what the origin of that is. It's like it came out of nowhere. And I don't see how that's helpful. Let's say I was 5 and in this classroom where they're teaching about the gender spectrum, I don't see how that would have been helpful for me either. Like, so I have a condition called gender dysphoria. It doesn't mean that I'm like a third gender, or it doesn't mean that I'm somewhere on this spectrum. I think that's really confusing kids, and it's a political narrative. It's not factual. It's not science based. If there's a child in a class who's experiencing gender dysphoria, absolutely, there are probably ways of supporting that child and helping their peers understand, don't bully them, and this condition exists. But I don't think kids need to be taught about sexuality or gender at an early age at all. I don't see where that's the place of schools to be teaching a political narrative that's confusing kids, because I've seen the spectrum. I mean, on one end, so it's one line. On one side is G.I. Joe, on the other side is Barbie. It's like, well, based on that, I'm not a man either, because I'm certainly not a GI Joe. Like, so I mean, unless you're a GI Joe or unless you're a Barbie, that means what? That you're trans or you're a third
Yeah.
sex. Like, it makes no sense. And most people aren't a GI Joe or a Barbie. Most of us, everybody has aspects of their personality and their temperament that is a mix of what we would think of as masculine or feminine traits, and that's completely separate from having a
Mm.
psychological condition called gender dysphoria.
Mm. And what's your opinion on, I could probably guess, but on raising children gender neutral? I'm seeing some stories about that as well.
I think it confuses them. I mean, we are the sex that we are, whether we like it or not. If someone has gender dysphoria, absolutely, there's a pathway of helping them and supporting them, and later in life, if it hasn't resolved and it's causing functional impairment, I reserve that option for people to medicalize, but I think that should be a last resort, and I think it's confusing kids to say, well, I mean, when my daughter was, before my daughter was born, we chose not to tell people what her gender would be, because her mom in particular was very much about, well, I don't believe in gender stereotypes, and I do support that. There's no reason that because we had a girl child that everyone had to buy pink. So we were being subversive at that time, saying, well, regardless of the sex of our child, we don't know what that child's personality is going to be. And, this kid may be a girl that likes to wear baseball caps and jeans. We don't know, but that's about gender stereotypes, and so we kind of were being subversive by saying, well, we're not going to tell you what the sex of our child is going to be, and if you're really concerned about wanting to buy us clothing and stuff for this child, buy green or purple or
Mm.
any color you want, because that doesn't matter, right? So, but
Hmm.
that I think is different than confusing the idea of biological sex. I mean, when our child was born, it was clear that she was a girl. If she had demonstrated gender dysphoria later in life, well, that would have been a separate conversation. But she was a girl, and there was no confusion about that.
Mm. I think some people also forget that there is just differences between boys and girls and men and women. There just is naturally differences, not just physical, but just in the way that men and women think psychologically. And yes, some people would argue that that's down to um, social constructs and the way that society molds men and molds women. But to me, I do think that men just are different to women, and um, I would imagine I've not got studies to back this up, but I imagine you raise 100 children gender neutral, I would say the majority of them would still identify as what they were identified as at birth. And that's just because boys and girls just are different
Mm-hmm.
on the most part.
Absolutely. I mean, even the fact that, something like autogynephilia only for the most part exists. I think there's some, maybe a few very, very rare cases of women having
Mm.
paraphilias, but for the most part, paraphilias only happen to men. And that's because men's sexuality and psychology is different.
Mm. Just switching gears a little bit, you've spoken before in a podcast about the social cues you experienced after transitioning. So the social cues of being a man, what were they, and how was that experience?
Yeah, I mean, people perceive their sense of safety, for example, depending on whether they're surrounded by men or women. It's a visceral response that people have, and so I learned pretty quickly that people need more physical space from me now that I appear male. So I ran into situations because I never didn't have many. I was definitely bullied and harassed for being a masculine woman. But I still was picking up on social cues, and so just doing all the same things that I had been doing, but now appearing male, I noticed people were responding to me differently, and I ran into a difficult, frightening situation one time. I was just walking down the street doing some window shopping on my lunch break, and the guy in front of me spun around and called me a faggot and, you know, accused me of like looking at his ass or something. And it's like, I was oblivious to the whole situation, but I guess I had been walking a little bit too closely behind him. And that just wouldn't have occurred to me when I was, female and appearing female. It just didn't occur to me. But and I don't think it's not like I was walking right behind him either, but people perceive physical space differently with men than they do women. And even touch, like men touch other men in ways that I don't even know if they're aware of it, but whether it's slapping them on the back, or I remember the first time a guy like put his hand on my chest. I mean, that had never happened to me as female, because that would have been really appropriate, but inappropriate if you did that to a woman. And it's something that I wish trans guys had more license to talk about, because I would have appreciated support just working through and figuring out all those little nuances that you can't possibly know until you're living it. But I remember a guy on one of the listservs. It was like one of those old-fashioned email listservs that we used to have. It was a listserv for trans guys in our province, and a guy was talking about an experience with his doctor. His doctor, I think, had like patted him on the back and said, "Hey, by the way, lay off the burgers," meaning you could afford to lose a few pounds. And the response from a lot of the trans guys was, "Oh, that's so fat phobic. We should do a letter writing campaign against this doctor and call him out on this bullshit." And so it just turned into like an oppression narrative. And I stepped in with a different perception of it. I said, had it occurred to you that he was just treating you like a dude, you're transitioning to become male. Maybe he was just trying to treat you as male as a way of affirming your identity. And the moderator of the group jumped in and said, "No, you're being like cis heteronormative, and this is an appropriate conversation on the listserv." And some of the younger guys on the listserv popped up and said, "Well, actually, I'm finding this conversation helpful, because that hadn't occurred to me," right? That men socially interact with each other differently, because I'm sure that male doctor probably wouldn't have patted a female patient on the back and said, "Hey, you're fat, lay off the burgers," right? So, but men talk to each other differently, to each other, and we have to learn. I saw that as my responsibility, and what I wanted from my transition. I wanted to do this successfully and not bother anyone around me. I wanted to be able to just function in the world as male to the best of my ability, which included learning some of those social interactions and picking up on those social cues. For me, that was an important part of my transition. And there's so little support to do that if you're buying into this queer theory narrative and your transition is all about being subversive and disrupting society. Then you're not trying to pick up social cues. You're not trying to get along with other people and blend in. And unfortunately, a lot of people have politicized trans to the degree that we're not, going back to this concept of a legal fiction, we're not stepping up to our responsibility in that legal fiction to say, I want to do this in a way that is mutually agreeable in society. I don't want to do harm to society. I don't want to disrupt my community or my church or my family or wherever I am. But it's become so politicized, and so many people are transitioning for political reasons. I think that they're actively trying to disrupt. And then wonder why we're getting such pushback.
I'm wondering if have you seen the documentary What is a Woman? Matt Walsh's documentary. I'm wondering what your opinion of that is. I have my own opinions, but I'm wondering what your opinion of it.
I thought it was interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think he did a good job of. I don't think Matt Walsh and I agree on everything. He's more conservative than I am, but just looking at the documentary at face value, I think he did a good job of just revealing how nonsensical the queer theory based ideology is. That if we can't even have a conversation about just material reality, I think he did a good job of exposing that.
And just on that theme, do you have an opinion on? Because I can imagine that some people's reaction to my opinions would be you don't have the right to have an opinion because you're not trans or you're not part of the LGBTQ plus community, um, and so why should we listen to you, or why is your opinion valid? Um, do you have an opinion on people who, like, obviously I can't have an opinion on the experience of being trans, but I believe I'm perfectly entitled to have an opinion on the policy surrounding it, and the social and cultural changes that are occurring at the moment.
Yeah, we're living in really tricky times, aren't we? Because we live in a pluralist society where our neighbors maybe have a
Yeah.
different political leaning or different values, different religions than we have, and somehow we have to exist as a society together. Um, I think I think it's human nature that we're going to have opinions about things. I have opinions about other countries'
Yeah.
social policies or their human rights violations. I guess it's hard to know where exactly do you draw the line between having an opinion, wanting to advocate for certain values. I mean, people, I don't know, like I'm not Ukrainian or Russian, but I have an opinion about what's happening over there. So, but at the same time, we also have to have boundaries where we allow people freedom to live their lives according to their own values, as long as they're not hurting anybody else. So it
Mm.
is hard. It is hard to know, like, when do we impose certain values because we feel like something's wrong, and when in a pluralistic society do we agree to disagree and say, look, I don't share your religion, I don't share your politics, I vote for a different party, but we're still neighbors. And it concerns me how much that is breaking down, that we've become these very separate ideological camps that are becoming more and more extreme, to the extent that we can't get along as neighbors or communities or countries anymore. Like, it feels like if this gets worse, we're headed for civil war, because
Mm.
we can't seem to coexist having differences of opinion anymore.
Mm. And just before we end, I want to be sympathetic of your time. Do you have advice for anyone who's experiencing gender dysphoria, or someone who knows someone that's experiencing gender dysphoria, parents? How should they approach the situation?
I think it's important to understand what gender dysphoria is from an evidence basis, and some why organization that is our goal, because we feel that information is being really obscured by activists with an ideological agenda. So I think it's important for just any decision making that parents and young people who, or even adults experiencing gender dysphoria, that they just understand the truth of what that experience is and what that means, because I think that empowers people to make the best choices for themselves. Going back to what I was saying, with childhood onset gender dysphoria, I'm sure parents, if they understood that most of the time that's a developmental stage in the development of homosexuality, they would probably make very different choices for their child than if they're told your child is trans, they'll always be trans and they need to transition. So
Mm.
I think the information that they have should be accurate and well understood before making any permanent decision, because even social transition is a clinical intervention. It's actually a very powerful clinical intervention. So telling kids, that they truly are the sex they think they are, and affirming that, and changing that legally and giving them a new name, that's a very powerful clinical intervention that is potentially going to lock them into an identity prematurely and make it a lot harder for them to desist. And I'm not saying that because I think it's awful to be a trans person. I'm just
Mm.
saying, if they could have avoided lifelong medical
Mm.
treatment and all of the complications that can come from that, why would avoiding that be a bad thing? If they can learn to be comfortable in their own bodies, whether it's a
Mm.
butch lesbian or an effeminate gay man, if they can learn to be comfortable with that, why is that a bad thing? So I think it's really important that families have accurate information.
Mm. And just to finish up, where can people stay up to date with what you're doing? Where can people find the Gender Dysphoria Alliance? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, we have a website with a lot of information called at www.genderdysphoriaalliance.com. And we also have a podcast called Transparency on YouTube, as well as audio only on podcast apps, and tons of resources. We're on social media, so it'd be great if someone wants to reach out to us.
Well, Aaron, thank you very much for taking the time. The conversation was exactly how I wanted it to be. It was very open, non-judgmental. So yeah, thank you very much for taking the time and like shedding some light on these issues for me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.